This last video is probably the most fun. It's nice to see things break, to go poorly, to go badly. So we're going to see some designs that are simply awful and they yield worthless data. The first is the voluntary response sample. This is where you simply throw it out there on Twitter or on a commercial and you invite people to respond. The problem with this is that only those who feel very strongly about a subject are likely to respond. The ones that don't care, who aren't motivated, you're not going to see their feelings represented in your poll. So, voluntary response sample, entertaining, but ultimately worthless. Samples like this are biased towards people who have strong opinions, especially those with strong negative opinions. Things that make us be offended are the ones that stir us to action. The ones that simply confirm what we already believe, we're more likely than not just to let it be. Now let's watch this video and see what the possible problems are here.
The question: should abortion be legal?
Yes, a woman has a right to choose what happens to her own body.
No, we have a duty to protect our unborn babies.
Now you can help decide this issue by voting today in the privacy of your home. Just call this number for yes or this number for no. $2 per call. Results of this poll will be forwarded to our state legislators. Should abortion be legal?
Yes.
No.
Today it's time for your voice to be heard. Call now.
What's the problem? Those who have strong feelings and $2 to waste are going to be making this phone call. So here's another real-world example.
A sample is only good if it truly represents the entire population. It's my job, and the job of statisticians in general, to ensure that a sample is truly representative. One of the keys in doing this is to replace human selection of individuals with some random process, such as a table of random numbers. Random selection eliminates the possibility of conscious or unconscious bias in the choice of our sample. Why is that important? Here's an example. In 1987, Cher Hite published the book Women and Love, which detailed women's attitudes on a wide range of subjects. She based her book on responses to about 100,000 questionnaires sent to women's and church groups around the country. Only 4,500 women, 4.5%, responded. One of her findings was that 70% of women married more than 5 years were having extramarital affairs. Hite's methods have been criticized for several reasons, but the most troublesome from a statistical point of view was her reliance on voluntary response. Only those women who cared enough about Hite's subject to fill out her very long questionnaire were included in the study. That's a form of bias, a systematic distortion of outcomes. It's unlikely that such a group of self-selected women is truly representative.
She's got a really nice definition of bias, a systematic distortion of outcomes. So you can see voluntary response can lead to worthless data.
I'm filling out a reader survey for Chewing Magazine. See, they asked how much money I spend on gum each week, so I wrote $500. For my age, I put 43, and when they asked what my favorite flavor is, I wrote garlic curry. This magazine should have some amusing ads soon. I love messing with data.
Convenience sampling is when we only go to ask people that is convenient for us to ask them. For example, you might just ask the people in your family. You might just ask the people in your neighborhood. You might even go to a store and stand there for an hour, and everybody who smiles at you, you ask them a question, and then there's your poll. All examples of convenience sampling. Things that are easy for you to do, but don't really represent the things we said you must do. Simple random sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, systematic sampling. There should be an element of randomization there, and often convenience sampling leaves that out completely, thus opening it up for bias. We simply might include individuals that are near us. Now here's another problem, undercoverage. That is when some portion of the population is not sampled at all, or it has a smaller representation in the sample than it has in the population. Undercoverage sometimes happens when portions of the population are hard to find. Here is a population that often gets underrepresented. How often do you take mass transit to work? Do we really ask prisoners in penitentiaries? Well, their answers would be 0, and those zeros would bring down the number. How about this? Do we often ask the homeless, what's your favorite fast food restaurant? Do we ask the homeless anything? The homeless are often underrepresented. These are examples of undercoverage. How many minutes a day do you use your cell phone? We're asking a woman on something that's not a cell phone. What if someone doesn't have a phone at all? And we ask this question. Well, how are we contacting them? Are we going from door to door, or are we making phone calls for these polls? See, undercoverage is often tied in with the method we use to contact people. Non-response bias. This is when you ask somebody and they just refuse to answer it. The problem is that those who don't respond may be different than those who do respond, and they may differ on just the variables we care about. If you mail surveys, a lot of those surveys are going to end up in the trash, I guarantee you. Now, response bias is when there's something wrong with your question. It could be anything in the survey that influences the responses to not give you accurate information. So in this little comic, he says, how would you rate the king's job performance? And he says, would you say he's doing a good job, an outstanding job, or a terrific job? And he says, I think I know who's paying for this poll. In other words, the design of the question itself showed you it was the king who was paying for the poll, and there was no possibility of saying, I don't like how he's doing. There are lots of problems that may lead to response bias. The respondent may not understand the question. The question may be in a language that the person just doesn't understand or doesn't understand fully. It's very possible to have someone be fluent in a small part of the language, but not be fluent in the entire language. So they may not understand the question. They just may out of embarrassment say no or yes and not really mean it. The question may be embarrassing. The question may be about former drug or alcohol use. The question may be about their personal life, in which case, because it's embarrassing, you may get a false answer or a non-response. The question itself may contain biasing information in it, or the order in which questions are presented can be an issue. For example, does anyone in your family belong to a union? Well, first of all, what do you mean by family? You mean my father, my mother? Do they live with me? You mean my siblings? What about if I have an older brother who's not living with me? You mean my second cousin? My third cousin? How far out does a family go? What do I count as my family? Are these always just the people related to me? Could it be stepbrothers, stepsisters, etc.? There's a problem with the terms of the question. Another way, do you believe that Haile Selassie has the role that many Rastafarians believe he has? Well, first of all, who is Haile Selassie and who are the Rastafarians? And what is this role that you're talking about? If you don't know any of the history behind this, and Haile Selassie was a leader of Ethiopia, Rastafarians are a certain religion. You may have heard of Bob Marley. He was a Rastafarian. I don't even remember the role that the Rastafarians believe he has. So how am I going to answer that question? How are you going to answer that question if you don't understand the terms? Even if you know the language, you still have to know the terms. Now here's some embarrassing questions. Did you have too much to drink last night? Could you understand the Complete Idiot's Guide to Statistics? See, it's very insulting, right? If you were a manager, would you hire a person with a tattoo? That might be embarrassing depending on who's asking the question. Do you agree, at least in part, with Hitler? Well, which part are we talking about? I mean, Hitler was a person that had a lot of thoughts. And like any human being, some of his thoughts were not controversial. What if Hitler liked ketchup and you like ketchup? Is it fair to say that you agree with Hitler about ketchup? The problem is the question. The question is not specific enough. So this is a response bias type problem. There may be biasing information contained within the question. Do you like President Bill Clinton? That might emphasize the fact that he's a president. He has some respect. Then the question may change to, do you like President Bill Clinton even though he was impeached for lying about a sexual affair involving Monica Lewinsky? So now we've gone beyond the basic question of do you like this person to now we've loaded the question with a negative situation. And you could see how answers might be different for the first question compared to the second question. Question: if offered a scholarship, would you attend the Wharton Business School of the University of Pennsylvania? Yeah, if offered a scholarship, why wouldn't I? If offered a scholarship, would you attend the same business school as Donald Trump? You didn't like Trump and you heard that in the question, then you may come up with a different answer, even though in both cases it was just an offer of a scholarship. Do you support immigration is one question. Do you support illegal immigration is an entirely different question. Do you support immigration for those in danger of their lives? Like refugees coming from another country. Many people may say yes to that. They may say no to the second question. They may say yes to the first question. Do you support immigration for those who want to take your job? Depending on how you modify the words of the question, you may get completely different answers, even for the same person, the same respondent. The order of the questions sometimes matter. How happy are you with your life in general? And how many dates have you had in the last month? The second question is sure to cause you a little bit of bummer, a little bit of depression if you haven't had many dates. But you may have forgotten about that when the first question comes along. Most people are happy with their life in general until they start thinking about negative aspects of their life. So, our takeaway on bias: there's no way to recover from a biased sampling method or a survey that has biased questions. You cannot fix bias. Once it's there, it's there. It's like a stain that never goes away. Getting a bigger sample for the same biased study just gives you a bigger pile of worthless data. There is no statistical method of removing bias. That's why you've got to make sure that you do everything ahead of time to minimize bias. Name the type of bias that could result. Here are the three possible answers: undercoverage, non-response, or response bias. A. The sample is chosen at random from a telephone directory. Is that undercoverage, non-response, or response bias? B. Some people cannot be contacted in 5 calls. Is that undercoverage, non-response, or response bias? C. Interviewers choose people walking by on the sidewalk to interview. Is that undercoverage, non-response, or response bias? Here are the answers. A was undercoverage. The sample is chosen from a telephone directory. Anyone not in that directory is not going to be questioned. Period. B was a non-response. Some people cannot be contacted in 5 calls, therefore they stop calling them. What about the people that would have answered on the 6th call, or the 7th call, or the 8th call? We're never going to hear from them. And finally, undercoverage in a specific kind, the convenience sampling. Interviewers chose people walking by on the sidewalk to interview. What if you were not walking by on the sidewalk? Did you have a possibility of being chosen? No. You had 0 chance of being chosen unless you were walking by on that sidewalk.